All right, so this is a review for AP for our first 2 units, well, second and third, UK and Mexico. I thought we'd just start with kind of some basic stuff that we need to remember about each of these countries that we talk about. Almost put USA, which would be the whole like federal, unitary, leaders, all that kind of stuff. So for each one we talk about, we got to know, are they unitary, are they federal, are they presidential, parliamentary, or semi-presidential, are they mixed? We need to know like head of state, head of government, that kind of idea. So these are all good things to have. And then if we also look at legislature as well. So is Mexico unitary or federal? Federal, and the UK is unitary. So this could make a good FRQ, like looking at what are the advantages of a unitary, what are the advantages of federal, like why would you choose to be unitary, why would you choose to be federal, and why would you choose one or the other, like why would you choose to be unitary? Okay, it's definitely more equal for all the different groups. And did you come to school late? Okay. Because you didn't come to second period, so that was why I asked. Okay. Anyway, you might choose it because your country is not as big. Like the more diverse your country is, the more you want a federal system, because the federal is going to allow you to meet more needs on a local level. How do unitary countries meet needs on a local level? Like what policies do they enact? Like what's that word so that they use devolution to become more federal in a sense. All right, Mexico, parliamentary, presidential, or semi-presidential? Presidential. And UK is parliamentary. My pen is dying. Okay, head of state in Mexico is his title. President. Oh. Yes, and it is Nieto. Does he have is it an accent or a tilde? And head of government, it's president, because in a presidential system it's both, right? Okay, in the UK, head of state? Queen. So it's a monarch, and in this case we have Queen Elizabeth II, and head of government is Prime Minister at this current time, Cameron, who is a conservative. How long a term does Nieto serve? 6 years, called the Sexenio. He is not re-electable. They only serve 1 term. Why did the Mexican government institute the Sexenio? You had to keep a dictator from running things, because remember we'd had the Caudillos had been controlling everything. And who came up with the idea of the Sexenio? Cardenas. All right. How often do they have to call for elections in the UK? At least every 5 years. Do you have to live in the district you run in? No. So we talked about safe seats, safe districts, how you can reward or punish people. What do you call those people who are kind of not important in the party and they're in the back of the party when they're sitting backbenchers? So this is kind of important vocabulary words. Okay, the legislature. What do we call? So we've got the legislature in Mexico. Are we bicameral, unicameral? Bicameral, what's our 2 groups in the legislature in Mexico? The Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. Okay, so we have the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. You don't have to know like the numbers. I think it's like 330 and something. You don't have to know the numbers. What you do need to know is that for head of state and head of government, they use first past the post to elect them. But in Mexico's legislature, they do a hybrid, and they do mostly first past the post, but then some people are elected proportional representation. So they do both. So we call that a hybrid when it's a mix. So you would need to say, you could either say on your test, you could say a mix of first past the post and proportional, or you could say a hybrid of first past the post and proportional, but you would want to put both. In the UK, the legislature is called the overall Parliament, and then Parliament is made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Are members of the House of Lords elected? No. And how are members of the House of Commons chosen? First past the post. Winner take all. And Cameron then is chosen. Remember, this is something that makes the Prime Minister parliamentary system different, is the fact that he's not directly elected by the people. He, is chosen by the legislature. And so that's something that is important. Okay? What's the only real power the House of Lords has? Amending. Yeah. Maybe while we have this up here, we could maybe do political parties. Would that be a good one to do too? Yeah. Try a different color here. All right, so as we're looking then at political parties, so these will be our political parties. All right, so in Mexico, what are our three parties? Who had the one-party dominant system for forever? And they had it until, when did forever end? 1920s to
was it like
2000. Yeah, and they take over, with the first president after Diaz is ousted, but they don't actually, their official name doesn't start, I think, till 1934. But, they've kind of run the whole time. So basically 70 years. Okay, we're talking about one-party rule for 70 years. So who are our two other parties? PRD and PAN. So when we look at the PRD is the one that came in second, the last election. They're a little more kind of social democrat, if you want to say. The PAN is a little more conservative. The PRD is a little more politically active. We might find them in some urban areas. A lot of young people. A little more left of the center. The pre-rule, the PAN's in the north. A little more left, I guess we could say. Do we say the Catholic Church with the PAN? Yes, rural. PRDs tend to be a little more young.
Wait, what did you put the PAN under the...
Conservative, North, Catholic. Older people, a little more young in the PRD. Okay, what about UK? What are our parties we need to know for the UK? Okay. Maybe I should have put the Liberal Democrats in the middle since they are kind of in the middle. But, yeah, and the Conservatives, sometimes also, what do they call the Conservatives? Tories. Tory party. And so the Conservatives are definitely, they would be compared more to like Republicans in our country. The Labor would be more like Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats would be more like Libertarians. That's a pretty good comparison. It's not 100% because the Conservatives in the UK are more liberal than Conservatives are in our country. And that's because they're just more in favor of welfare state and more socialized things than we are. But if you could kind of keep that in mind, that helps you with those. And then who would be some people that we would want to know? Like who would be maybe somebody from this party we'd want to know? Who's the one big guy we talk about from this party? Tony Blair, who came up with the Third Way, which is kind of the revamp of the Labor Party. We don't want to be so far left just representing the Unionists anymore. We want to be somebody who appeals to everybody, the more centrist kind of view. So with the Conservative, obviously... You're fine. I just thought it was Hannah again. With the Conservatives, obviously, we have Cameron, who we've mentioned, and then who's another great one? Thatcher with her neoliberalism, right? Sure. Neoliberalism, if you just think neoliberalism equals capitalism. Neoliberalism is a move from nationalized business to a move to privatization. It actually ties a lot in with Mexico's, kind of pendulum theory, that whole kind of swinging left to right. So on one side, you're going to have neoliberalism, and this would be anything that's more free market, anything that's more capitalism. We're going to say yes to foreign investment, all those things. And then on the other hand, and with that, this is kind of the key word, and this is what Thatcher was always doing, and I'm having spelling issues here, but that's privatization. And the opposite of privatization is nationalizing businesses. So the UK, after World War II, with the Beveridge Report and collective consensus and the welfare state creation, nationalized a lot of their businesses, meaning that the government controlled them. So she's saying the economy is bad. It's the 70s. The economy is bad because we're spending all this money on the welfare state. So she says we got to increase our economy. We're going to become more capitalist. We're going to privatize businesses, and we're going to bring in an increase of money and cut back the welfare state a little bit. And it works. It's doing better. And Tony Blair says, okay, there has to be a middle way where we can keep neoliberalism, but we also can still provide for the welfare state. And so that's what the third way is really offering. You see this in Mexico, the pendulum theory, because then you have, like over here, this would be like Diaz saying, yes, let's get foreign investment, let's do lots of capitalism. And then comes in Cardenas, who is going to nationalize businesses. And like a good example of this would be Pemex, the Mexican petroleum, where the government owns that. And, you know, that's a major resource for Mexico, and so they're getting money in as a result of that. Okay, so that's kind of your two extremes. Does that make sense? More socialism this way, less that way. And this is an example of the pendulum theory, which we see very much in Mexico. We get one president who's very much this way. You get another president comes in, brings in other policies, and then we switch back and forth. That kind of idea. Okay? All right, what else is on our list here? So we've hit welfare state. All right, let's talk about the difference between nation and state. That seems to be tricking up a lot of people. We were just talking about that in fourth period. So the UK is really a great way to think of this. We have the UK, which is a state. So this is our big idea, the UK. And it's made up, this equals 4 nations. So one state, in the case of the UK, equals 4 nations. So the state's the big idea, the nation is the smaller idea. So what are our 4 nations in the UK? Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. So UK is the big idea, and the small ideas, it's kind of the way to think about it. State is big. You can be a nation and also be a state, like we said with France or Germany.
Can you call the other nations countries?
No, you would say the state is a country.
So you wouldn't refer to like England as a country?
No. Mm-mm. You would say the nation. You would say the nation of England.
State has sovereignty over a nation.
Yes, and that's the key thing. The state is the one with authority or with sovereignty. Yes, Hannah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, so like.
Here's the way we get around it. Like we would say the U.S., this is how we get around it. We combine the words. We say the U.S. is a nation state. Or you say it's a country.
So you wouldn't call the UK a country?
You'd call the UK a country. Yeah. So state is the same word that we use as country.
And so nation would be all word you use.
Yes, there's subunits. Like you could say that it has 4 subunits. So the one UK state is made up of 4 nations. So like the U.S., we were just talking about this in fourth period, the U.S. isn't really made up of several nations. Like we're the mutt country. We're the melting pot of everything. There's no like one big group. I mean, like we are, the majority are Caucasian, but even the Caucasians in our country are made up of multiple. Like my own family is made up of multiple nations. It's German, it's Scotch, it's Irish. My name is French, so there has to be some French in there somewhere. That's where we originally came from before we went to England. There's a whole bunch of that. Plus I have Native American in me. And if you've lived in America for any amount of time, You pretty much have a mix. There's pockets in our countries where we have groups, like, you know, in New York City, you got Little China, Little Italy, where you get these little pockets. But I think this is why this is such a hard concept, because it doesn't really work in the U.S. So, and you think about countries like France and Italy, like the majority of those people who live in those countries are the same ethnicity. So Italy is both a nation and a state. Okay? The states would be, they don't, like in France they say provinces, they don't say states. That's why it's confusing for us also, is because in America we use the word state. But it comes from the fact with the Articles of Confederation, our states had so much power. Like that's why we use that term. We always have been a country where no other country in the world practices federalism like we do. Our states in the United States have more power than any other federal subunits in the world that I know of, that I've ever studied, compared to like Russia or India, anybody else who works as federal. And most of the world is unitary anyway. You know, we're that weird exception. All right. We're familiar with the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution. We understand the whole concept of Constitution of the Crown, the fact that they don't have a written constitution. It's based on tradition, common law. We went over Labor versus conservative parties. We went over Thatcher, Blair, Cameron. The Prime Minister is, of course, chosen by the legislature. He must be from, or she, from the majority party. And they must have an election at least every 5 years. They don't have to live in the district that they're elected from. What kind of powers does a Prime Minister have? Yeah, they have a lot of powers. They don't really veto. That's not really a power because they're the ones who are proposing legislation. Like in the case of the UK, isn't it like 95% of legislation is proposed by the Prime Minister? I mean, it's a ridiculous amount. And it's almost always passed because they're the majority party. When we think about they're the commander-in-chief, they're usually, especially in the case of the UK, they're the one who has the right to call for a referendum. Remember that referendums are national votes that have the force of law. They help to, my favorite reason to use it is that it increases legitimacy. It also is more democratic. It also bypasses the whole like red tape of legislature. And obviously a proposed referendum is the one that they're having in June about whether or not to stay in the EU. They most recently had one about whether or not Scotland should be independent. Yes, sir.
And Prime Minister probably can't pass an executive order.
They don't, as far as I know. But they are commander-in-chief, so I guess if it was military related. Also remember that the cabinet, while we're speaking of prime ministers, I'll double check into that, Nate. The cabinet remember the prime minister is a one of equals, that they tend to be people who are important in the party, not necessarily people who are experts, as opposed to American cabinets where the president picks people who are obviously of the same party, but he picks people who are experts in their field. And if they also believe in that whole solidarity as a cabinet, and if you don't agree, then you step down. Okay. Noblesse oblige, that whole idea with the welfare state, that the nobility, the wealthier people in Britain have an obligation to help those less fortunate. The coalition government, we're clear on that, which was from 2010 to 2015 between the Conservatives and the the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And it was necessary because the Conservatives didn't have the majority. The Labour Party could have formed one with the Liberal Democrats. If they had formed a coalition first, they would have had the majority. So it's whoever has the majority. 2010 to 2015. I don't know that you would need the date for that. Just be aware that it was recent. Are we okay on devolution in the UK? Just to know that Wales and Scotland and all of those have been getting more powers. It's also when you see, sorry, I had unitary up here before. When you have a unitary country, that's a way you give more power to your localities, is through devolution. We also, in the public policy articles we read the other day, we just saw the most recent form of devolution is that the UK just passed that English Parliament members, MPs, get to vote on English laws now, which is another sign of devolution. Even the fact of the mayor in London having more power is another sign of devolution. Which election system would Liberal Democrats be in favor of?
Thomas Bradlin, please report to the main office. Thomas Bradlin, please report to the main office.
Austerity, are we okay on austerity? So remember that austerity measures are taken when you have a bad economic conditions, and that this is usually when you have a budget deficit as a result of bad economic conditions, and you have to do one of two things: either increase your revenue through taxes or decrease spending. And typically when we talk about austerity measures, we're talking about decreasing of spending. And so in the UK, they cut back on the welfare state is one of the examples of that.
So they increase revenue for taxes or what?
Or cut spending.
And the Liberal Democrats are in favor of that? Is that what you said?
No, that's proportional representation.
Oh.
Okay, Eurosceptics, people who are opposed to being in the EU. And the EU is a supranational organization. Remember, that means they have sovereignty over the nations involved. And that's why the Supreme Court had to be created in the UK. All right, any other kind of big questions about the UK?
Wait, you said the Prime Minister has the power to propose legislation.
Which is different from a president.
What was the other?
Commander-in-Chief, he also does appointment heads.
So the Prime Minister does appoint like the cabinet people?
And remember the terms like shadow cabinet, which is led by the opposition party. They're ready to take over, remember? So who's the opposition party right now in Britain? Labour. Labour is it's whoever has like the second most votes. All right, so for any other questions on the UK before I move on to Mexico? Okay, I think we've hit a lot of these already. For most of the 20th century, Mexico had one-party rule. The demographics of Mexico, remember that it is largely largely mestizo, which is that European Amerindian mix. Is it 80% are mestizo, I believe is the right statistic. 20% are Amerindians. That's also the biggest cleavage. There's also, what are the other cleavages? Urban versus rural. Social class or wealth is always a big one. Yeah. Region, north versus south is another one. When we think about how the mountains, make kind of travel communication difficult. The cartels, the corruption, all those things are a part of that. The caudillo is one of your vocabulary words. That's dictator. So Diaz would be an example of a caudillo. And then basically what they set up is after Diaz, they set up this one-party rule where one person would rule and then they would choose the next person and so on. And so it was passing it on kind of from one person to another. And that's how the PRI got into power. And they had elections, but they really were choosing who was next, and the PRI dominated everything. The camarilleros are the form of patronage or patron-client relations. That whole you scratch my back, I scratch your back, I'll give you a favor. The Mexican miracle, remember this is that period of growth we see in Mexico, and then it tanks because the oil prices drop. We discussed the political parties, we've discussed the ethnic cleavages. Linkage institutions for all these guys are the same things. What are our linkage institutions? Media, elections, interest groups, and political parties. Okay, we've already discussed if they're federal unitary. We've discussed the Sejenio. Any questions on that? What's good about the Sejenio? Having this 1 6-year term. Prevents one person from ruling a dictatorship. It prevents, if we have a really bad guy, from him staying a really long time, although 6 years is a pretty long time. They can be impeached. Difficult, but can be happening. It goes through Congress. Remember, they don't have a prime... I don't know who would judge it. I mean, they have a Supreme Court. The independent judiciary issue in Mexico is the fact that the Supreme Court justices all step down when the new president comes in.
Okay, so, but Mexico is the only one that doesn't have an independent judiciary.
They do have an independent judiciary, but the question is how really independent is it? They have a Supreme Court.
They just got
The UK just got a Supreme Court, yes. just in the last decade. Okay, Diaz, the Porfiato, who's going to say it? Thank you. Porfiato. Say it again, Jenna. Porfiriato. Okay, that is this dictatorship under Diaz, who we just discussed him, how he was more about the capitalism policies, but he wasn't a good guy. Like, he definitely harshed on people's civil liberties, and that's why they had a revolution and got rid of him. Okay, so the revolution starts in 1910. It takes him a while to get rid of him. He says he's going away, and then he comes back, and he's a bad guy. 1917 is the Constitution. That's an important date to know. That's where they trace back a lot of their authority. When we're thinking about traditional authority of the crown in Britain, we're thinking about rational legal authority with the Constitution and elections in Mexico. Cardenas is the one who starts the Sexenio. He's the one that's more for nationalization. He starts Pemex, the petroleum, British Petroleum, that's BP. Pemex is Mexican Petroleum. We talked about the revolution, the pendulum theory. Women in Mexico, remember that there is an increased participation of women in Mexico. Have we ever had a woman president? No. Have we had a woman presidential candidate? Yes. So remember, the PAN actually ran a woman last election. I think this is the breakdown. Don't quote me exactly. I think 36%, 32%, and then 28 or 26%. I mean, they didn't do horrible. We talked about the problems with Mexico's judiciary, and we discussed Mexico's legislature. So any questions on those? We went over a lot of short answers in class today, and of course they're available in Classroom in each of your classes. You can click on those. When we're looking on the back, then are there any of these that may concern you? Let's look at number 5. What's political ideology?
Self-coherent beliefs about how politics should be.
Yes. And if we're talking about a political party, like your ideology, your party, what you stand for. Okay, right? And so this question says, identify one political party that participated in the 2006 presidential elections. That'd be one of these 3. And then it says, describe one central element of its political ideology. So then you would have to talk about what they believe. So I would maybe do the PAN, because that's a little easier to do. The fact that it's conservative, that it supports the church, that kind of thing, or has closer ties to the church. Because remember, if you're a clergyman, you can't run for office in Mexico. Any other ones on that back of this that you want me to go over? Let me real quickly before we do that, are there any other general questions? Because I'm going to cut off the Swivl if there are no more general questions and just answer any kind of specific FRQ ones. Adios. Cheers.